All right, staying with the story now to unpack this, let's now speak to Professor Guy Midgley, Professor and Director of the School for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch University. Prof, a very good afternoon to you and thank you so much for your time. I mean, the situation in KwaZulu-Natal is devastating to say the least. This is a province that is still reeling from the 2022 floods. 3 years later, we are seeing homes submerged in water. The provincial government saying earlier that about 20 people have died over the past 2 months due to widespread flooding. Let's first get your take on what we are currently seeing in the province.
Well, thanks for having me. It's incredibly sad when there's loss of human life, people lose their homes, their belongings, and particularly people who are poor. This is devastating for the country, and it's destabilizing socially, and it's not good for anybody. But what we're seeing is really a result of what is at the moment a much warmer Indian Ocean, which seems to be juicing up the intensity of cyclones and the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, which makes clouds, which makes rain. And a lot of the winds are blowing this onshore into KwaZulu-Natal. So it's a part of the country that's particularly badly affected by the cyclone season. And it's likely that this is at least partially due to global warming. And it's not going to go away soon.
And that is devastating to hear. I mean, when we look at how these conditions could be exacerbated, as you say, by climate change, water warming, as you suggest, what would you then say is needed from a governance and perhaps a funding perspective, not only in KwaZulu-Natal? At the aftermath of the 2022 floods, there was anticipation that much needed funds would be made available at national level, just given the extent of the damage of those floods. But just hearing your words now, one then needs to almost have a futuristic kind of a look in terms of what are those sustainable plans that are needed in the country. Well,
we're in an age of consequence of a lack of action on climate change since the 1980s. These sorts of effects were predicted and anticipated with some uncertainty from the 1980s, but governments have not stepped up to the plate, including in some ways South Africa, although we argue, for our development space. The problem is that it comes with a cost, and it's this cost, the environmental cost of extreme weather events. These are the first wave of our exposure to climate change, seems to be in the form of extreme weather events. And they're teaching us a lot about how we need to adapt and adapt very, very quickly. Funding is a major issue, but the state has the ability to create fiscal resources. A treasury creates fiscal resources, they print money. And if it's spent into the right places, it pays the South African citizen back many, many times over. So, for example, every rand spent on weather services can pay back between 4 and 5 rand in benefit. And that ramps up if the weather services are linked in with international weather services, up to 20 to 1. So there's no real reason for government not to invest in adaptation, to invest in weather services, and to invest in better building techniques and to create jobs in the area of climate change adaptation and recovery. Those are investments that will pay back many, many times over and also help to alleviate unemployment. So I don't see why we're not acting more decisively from the top, from Treasury, to make resources available. And you don't have to tax people more for it. They're responsible for producing fiscal resources. They don't have to drag it out of our citizens.
Especially when, you look at conversations and what people are suggesting in terms of just your long-term planning and, solution, looking at, for one, spatial design and even smart cities. I mean, in the immediate, how do regions like KwaZulu-Natal and other provinces like Eastern Cape, as an example, flood-proof themselves as a way going forward? We're also reporting, as you would have heard, severe flooding has also led to temporary suspension of operations at 4 ports of entry in the country. I would imagine that comes at a huge cost.
This is now an emergency, and it has to be addressed with a full-blooded approach that includes planning right across the region. We've now seen enough to be convinced, I think, that we are now facing a situation in which further extreme event impacts will significantly degrade our urban environments and our rural environments unless we very rapidly ramp up adaptation planning and implementation. We're kind of asleep at the wheel in a way. We've got the Climate Change Act. We've got everything we need to. We've got the Act on extreme events, disaster risk and recovery. We need to roll these things out now very fast. Also, the military. If we could train our military in disaster recovery and give them a peacetime mission relating to disaster recovery, I think that would also help us.
Yeah.
So we've got resources. We've got a lot of unemployed people who want to work. Yeah. So I really don't see why we're not acting more decisively, working with our academics. We've got strong academic centers in KZN and throughout the country. You can help to define a plan of action and put it together. We've got excellent people in this country, but we're not using them. And that is, to me, it's really, it's sad. Why aren't we doing it? Yeah. This is an emergency. It's an emergency.
And I think you raise a very important point there, Prof, by the SANDF comment. And also on the other side of that, we're also looking at water shedding, a conversation obviously we'll have on another day. But thank you so much for your time and your analysis, Professor Guy Midgley, there, Professor and Director of the School for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch.